So for today we're going to be learning about Checking Out Me History by John Agard. The poem here looks through the voices and the experiences of John Agard at our understanding of identity through history. We look at how history is taught in the UK and the conflict between the fact and truth, which is sometimes obscured by the race and gender. The poem gives examples of powerful black figures from history, often involved in conflicts themselves in one way or another, and it makes it clear that those black figures are often overlooked in favour of the white figures involved in that same history. Noticeably, the poet emphasises how we as the British, white British, often celebrate our national or cultural history without looking at the history and culture of those we were in conflict with. John Agard himself was born in Guyana, a Caribbean country just in the north of South America. However, he moved to Britain in 1977. Checking Out My History was published in 1997. Starting then at the beginning of the poem, which would be a sensible place really to start, we start off with "Dem tell me." And we have that repeated several times throughout the poem. In fact, "Dem tell me" almost becomes the calling card or a motif of the poem. And that repetition of "dem" and "me" creates a sense of them and us. So, that emphasises the separation between the poet and the British education system. Looking then at the third line of the poem, the stanza, the phonetic spelling that we have here really gives us this feature, this linguistic feature throughout of the phonetic spelling. And that his accent and dialect, the "what dem want to tell me." The phonetic spelling gives us a clear sense of the narrator's voice. So phonetic spelling gives a clear sense of the narrator's voice, highlights this idea of identity throughout. Carrying on this stanza here, in the second stanza, "bandage up me eye." So here we have this idea, this deliberate attempt, and this part of this theme throughout of these metaphors of vision and blindness, and how vision, people can't see because they are blinded. And he's arguing here not a physical blindness, but a metaphysical blindness caused by a lack of education. So we have this bandage up me eye, and then shows this almost deliberate attempt to hide history. Carrying on then, we move on to the second half of this line with "me own history." And then we have this idea of this repetition, me own history, me own identity. And that structural feature of the repetition here, at this point in the poem, is really quite clearly showing us that it connects his heritage and his personal history. So the heritage and personal history are connected. Looking down to the third stanza, "Dem tell me about 1066 and all that." He's dismissing, so here it dismisses British culture. And at this point, we're starting to see some of the structural ideas come through, where the poem alternates between historical and fictional figures from Caribbean and British culture, just to really show that idea between them, to highlight that again. In the next line, we have Dick Whittington and the he cat. So he's comparing British history here. To pantomime. And where he's doing that, it's making British history seem trivial. Like it's not important, like it's all just stories. No, them never tell me about that. At the end of this stanza, that double negative is assertive and angry. Toussaint, a slave with vision. And here we have this succession of short lines. So looking at the form of the poem, we've got a move from this almost narrative poetic structure at the start to suddenly stanzas with much shorter lines. And you can see this as we go through the poem, how they're physically separated as well. In the AQA anthology, they are italicized as well. So not in every version, but in most they are. The succession of short lines here slows the pace down. It's like he's breaking off from his main point to try and think about his memory. So the shorter lines move to a slower pace because he is recalling memory. And it's interesting as well that when he's thinking about his Caribbean culture, that the black history that he has to take time to remember it, because his education was all about the British culture and not about the black culture that he feels it should have been more focused upon. And we have here as well this idea of vision and beacon. And looking at the idea of vision and beacon, they're both images of light. So because we've got these images of light, it contrasts with the blindness. Remember, it's that metaphorical blindness. Of his education. Moving on then, after these images of light contrasting with the blindness, we have the idea of Napoleon battalion. And here we start to see these strong rhymes, Napoleon battalion, and the broken syntax here as well shows the importance of oral communication to him. So the broken syntax, which means word order, and strong rhyme shows the importance of oral communication. Remember, poems originally, in their purest form of the ancient Greeks and Romans, were ways of passing stories on from one to one another, and they were very rarely written down until we got into the later Roman times, and then the Romans started to record some ideas of their poetry in the Greek poetry that they would hear. But 99 times out of 100, the poems and the plays were simply left as verbal. The repetition of the word Toussaint makes it sound like a chant. So Toussaint a slave, blah blah blah. Toussaint the thorn to the French. Toussaint the beacon. It's chant, and it's confident and forceful, showing that he has the confidence in his own history. A lot of scribbly lines on this one today, but the two sound notes are important. Carrying on to look at the final stanza on this page. Them tell me about the man who discovered a balloon and the cow would jump over the moon. They tell me about the dish ran away with the spoon. They never tell me about Nanny de Maroon. And here we have this, the use of nursery rhyme and the simple rhyme scheme. Both of these ideas are making British history look silly and trivial. So the rhymes really interestingly build up to the last line. So looking at the rhyme scheme here, so the simple rhymes, I'm going to give you plenty to write about on this one. The simple rhymes make a mockery of British history. And in doing that, in making that mockery of British history, it makes it seem trivial and silly. The second point I'd make about all this is the rhyme builds to the last line of the stanza. And because it's building up to that last line, it highlights what he wasn't taught. So looking at the second page then, and we start with Nanny Seafar Woman of Mountain Dream, Firewoman Struggle, Hopeful Stream to Freedom River. Now we've got lots to say about this, but we've got Seafar Woman. It's again the idea it's linked to vision. Like she can see into the future. So she's not a fortune teller, she can see into future. Of Mountain Dream. So linking these three ideas here of Mountain Dream, Hopeful Stream and Freedom River, linking these three ideas together here, these three all connect Nanny de Maroon to nature and water because she's spiritual. She's also commonly associated with hope and liberty. So links Nanny with nature and water. And then from Nanny, also linked with freedom. And as well as freedom, she's also linked with hope. She is very spiritual as well, is a note that I would make as well. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo. They never tell me about Shaka the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus in 1492. But what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks too? And we've got again this simple rhyme throughout. Again, highlighting and building up to those things that he hasn't been taught. Looking at the language used here, the fact that we have Columbus and the Columbus mentioned on line 34 and straight away into Caribs and the Arawaks, it's an immediate juxtaposition. Where the West, I should say rather than West, the European and indigenous cultures collide. So looking then at the next stanza on line 36, them tell me about Florence Nightingale and She Lamp. It almost sort of makes her seem unimportant. And the way that it's, it's just thrown away. And the fact that she's then mixed in with characters like Robin Hood and Old King Cole, it undermines her. So, the nursery, if I can spell that, nursery characters undermine her. Looking then, we have these Robin Hood and Old King Cole. They used the figures from British folklore and almost mythology, contrasted with Mary Seacole, who was an important real-life figure. So then looking at the final of the abbreviated stanzas, we have from Jamaica she travelled far to the Crimean War, and it seems more real and relevant than the scenes from white history. Even when the British said no, so she is defiant and brave. A healing star. So here we have the healing star and the yellow sunrise. So this idea, this metaphor here, links her very clearly to the idea of warmth, light, and hope. And then looking at the final stanza of the poem, it echoes very much so the start of the poem. Them tell me what I want to tell me, but now I checking out my own history, I carving out my own identity. And we have that reminder again of the oral tradition, that things were spoken from using spoken word, and it reminds us of his anger, so that we have the phonetic language reminds us that. And then at the end we have this final emphatic word, this really important structural note of identity. And I've just forgotten to highlight those two lines as well. So carving out my own identity, and it's an emphatic final word. And the fact that we're finishing on this idea of identity really rams it home that this is one of the key ideas in the poem, that he is trying to find out his identity as we go along. So the emphatic final word sums up main theme. The main themes and ideas in this poem, I'm going to try and stay away from the obvious identity one and give you some other ideas to write about, so when you come to write about the actual poem itself. So the first theme or idea that you could write about, or arguably one of the feelings, would be anger. And the fact that the narrator is angry. And he's not angry at people, he's angry at the whole education system. The second idea would be of admiration. And he admires the Caribbean figures. It's almost that we have this respect for them as well, because he wants to tell their stories to show the important role that they've played in history that's possibly ignored more by white education. And the celebration, at the end, he says that he's going to embrace his own identity. So the notes that I'd put up at the top, the poems that you could compare this with, if you think about the idea of anger, actually the idea of anger could easily be compared to a range of poems. You could compare it with the ideas in Bayonet Charge and Exposure, with the soldiers' anger at being sent out there. But the one that I would choose, were I to be given the option, I would choose to compare it with the narrator's anger in London. His anger at the people not being helped. It's a similar idea of someone not doing something for another group. You could also talk about the idea of identity. And this idea of identity is very keenly explored in Tissue and also in Emigre. And then another one that you could write about could be to compare this idea of cultural heritage. And now that's a tricky one, and I would hope you don't get one about cultural heritage, but that could be compared quite easily to Kamikaze, with the comparison between the Japanese culture and what we would expect. You could talk about Emigre as well.